Hello, everybody. Welcome to Child Welfare Part 1 Statistics, Assumptions, Context, and Definitions. I divided child welfare into two different lectures. They are, of course, closely related, but it's a little easier to bite off when we do it in two parts for this particular topic. Okay. All right. So we're going to start with my context because I think that is important to understand in order to understand kind of the direction that I'm coming at this from. Then we're going to talk about yours, and then we're going to talk about the conversation. Um, we're going to talk about the terminology, very basic terminology. There's going to be more in part two, and a little bit how to think about being a child welfare worker um, in practice. Okay. So I did spend most of my career in child welfare. Um, I was, for actually my very first job was as a supervising social worker for resource families. That's what we call them now. At that time, we called them foster families and adoptive families, and they were kind of in two different categories. They aren't anymore in two different categories. We just consider them all to be resource families. The idea being that, anybody can, adopt a child. If you are good enough to be a foster parent, you are good enough to be an adoptive parent, and we would hope that you would be open to adopting any child that you would welcome into your home. Um, I've written many home studies for before we had the whole resource parent concept for foster parents and for adoptive parents. Of course, now it's the same thing, so I've written those as well. But I could not even give you a count. If I had to guess, I would say 70, something like that. Home studies that I've written for families hoping to adopt or foster. I've been doing this a long time. And there was a period of time where I worked for Children's Council. So in most counties, the attorneys for children are appointed the same way that they're appointed for parents. They're appointed from a pool of private attorneys who agree to work for a certain rate. And in some counties, it works a little bit different. In Alameda County, for example, there is a specific law firm that represents all the children in Alameda County, with very few exceptions. It's like 98% of the children in Alameda County. The only reason why they would not represent a child is if they had a conflict of interest. So the needs of one child conflicts with the needs of a different child, and at that point, a child would be represented by a different attorney. But their model includes having a number of social workers on staff, and the attorney whose job it is to assess what is in the best interest of the child um, will send out a social worker to figure that out on their behalf and report back. And so I did that for a while. Um, I was a county worker in a Bay Area county as well. I was in continuing services, so basically, after they have made their way through emergency services, they come to, and they've gone through disposition. We'll talk about what those mean in a bit. But after they've gone through disposition, for the most part, they go to continuing services for whatever the plan happens to be. So I did that for a while. And I also was a trainer at a local CASA. So my job was to train the court-appointed special advocates to do their role for the court. There's mandated training for them that is prescribed in the legislation of what they need to be trained on for how many hours and all of that. And I it was my job to recruit them and to train them and to make sure that they were prepared to do that job. So I did all of that. I've done other things too, but that's all the stuff that I've done in child welfare. And so I do come to it with a lot of experience to draw upon. Okay, so if you've had a look at the assigned discussion for this task, for this topic, I'm sorry, you will know that you are asked to think through what your assumptions are before you really do anything. And if you have not taken a look at the discussion, I would ask you to pause the lecture, go find the discussion, read through the instructions, and then return. Otherwise, these slides aren't going to make a whole lot of sense to you. So, the first thing that I want you to do is I want you to think through where your ideas on this topic come from. Now, some of you are going to have very clear, well-defined ideas about child welfare and what you believe that it is and what the structures are and what it does and all of that. And a lot of you won't. A lot of you won't have really any defined ideas about them that you can articulate. But I think once you sit down and really think about it, everybody has some sort of concept of what this topic is. So, here's some questions to get you started about all of that. You don't have to stick to these necessarily, but this is an interesting way to get rolling. If you are a person with a bunch of privileges, it is really useful to think about how those privileges advantage you in this area. And so if you're not really aware yet of what those might be, not to worry. You can just say, I don't really know, what my privileges are in this area. I'm not really aware of it. And that in itself is a privilege, is to not be actively thinking about your involvement with child welfare services is in itself a privilege. Okay. So here's the context for our conversation, but don't write these down yet because we're going to take them one at a time, okay? So these are the 2023 numbers, and those are the most recent that we have the most recent settled complete numbers, because they often do get revised after they're published. So there are 2024 numbers as of this recording in June of 2026, but these are the settled numbers, so I stuck with those. In 2023, there were 343,000 children in foster care in the United States. About 108,000 of those, so about a third, were waiting for adoption. The average length of stay was about 21 months. Black and Native American children were disproportionately represented. So, if the black children are 20% of the population, maybe they're 40% of the dependent population, that sort of thing. 20 to 30% of youth who age out of care experience homelessness within a few years, and the average age is 8.3 years. Okay, so that's where we're starting from. And I'm going to just kind of pause on this and just think about those for a second and think about kind of what picture you're drawing in your head. So the statistics here are real, right? But they may already have led you to create a particular story in your head, right? It would be very difficult not to create a story in your head if I'm telling you that, the average age is 8.3 and a third of those kids are waiting for adoption and the average length of stay is almost 2 years. It's very, very hard not to build that image in your head, right? And that would make sense. So, you're picturing some sort of typical child in foster care, right? And probably what the purpose is, like why are they there? What are we doing here? And what happens to the children while they're in that system? And here people often have very firm ideas. So I want you to pause here and write some notes to yourself about your beliefs. And again, you don't have to limit yourself to what's on the slide. This is just here to get you rolling. Whatever you have in your mind is worth jotting down, right? And what you share in the discussion is up to you. You don't have to share every stray thought that you have in the discussion if you don't want to, but at least for your own notes, it's a really good idea to kind of write down everything and then curate later if you feel like you need to. All right. So, like I said, we're going to take these one at a time, and these are the ones we're going to take first. So, there are 343,000 children in foster care. All right. So, what does that mean? There are different categories of foster care. So, what the plan is for each of those children really matters for their outcomes, for where they end up, for what their plan is, for kind of where you're headed with that case. Reunification is being returned to their family, right? They're being returned to the people that they were removed from. When you put together reunification and the kids who are at home on trial visits, so technically they're still in foster care, but they're living at home with their parent on a trial basis. You put those two things together, you get almost half of the children in foster care. So the plan is to bring them home in a permanent way, almost half. Okay, so another almost quarter is adoption. And then when you add in guardianship, relative, long-term foster care, so these are like all long-term solutions, you get about a third. Now, if this were me, I would actually take out long-term foster care from this particular line because guardianship and relative care and adoption all have the same, well, not the same, but they all have similar levels of sense of permanency for the family and for the children for the most part, but long-term foster care does not. So the long-term foster care often feels to the youth as very temporary, that their home is not their own, that they're not really part of the family, more in a way that we would kind of stereotypically picture in our head of a foster home instead of a permanent home. So long-term foster care, I think I would pull out of there. I don't really know exactly what that number would be. It's going to be different in California than it's going to be nationally. And of course, these are national numbers. If I had to guess, I would say about half that number is long-term foster care, but don't quote me on that. Okay. So, other and multiple, so multiple plans, there's no data or not yet established. Okay. So other, I don't know. I don't know what the others would be. Multiple, we don't do multiple in that way in California, but I can picture that in other states what they might do is they might say, we have a plan of reunification with a secondary plan of adoption. That's not quite how we phrase it in California, but I can certainly picture it in other states being phrased in that way. Data missing. Why would the data be missing? Well, often we're going to have very partial data from Native American populations because they don't always they don't always share all of their information, and their data gathering is not necessarily the same because they're not held to the same federal reporting requirements, right? They're sovereign nations. So it's very hard sometimes to fold in the Native American data here. Um, However, the large majority of this, I think, is from the not yet established um, portion, and that just means that the kids are new, right? That the kids are new into care, and a goal, a case goal, has not yet been established. So there's a point in the case where that goal is established. It is not in the first 5 minutes, right? So, the kids who have not hit that point in the case yet don't have a plan, technically speaking. So they're going to fall into this bucket. Okay. I would, if I had to guess, I would say probably, you know, 3/4 or more of this category is probably those kids who are predisposition. Okay, so right, there are many kids attached to child welfare who are not in foster care per se, that are not included in this 343,000 figure. What does that mean, Lark? So, um, it turns out that nationally we track maltreatment uh, reports, investigations, foster care data, adoption data. We track all sorts of things. But what we don't track is kids who are court dependent, but they are not uh, in foster homes, right? Or they're not in out of home placement, right? Which is the broader way of stating that. In California, this is not an insignificant number of children. This is almost a quarter of kids who are court dependent, and they have the full on case, they have the lawyers and all the things, right? But they're not in foster care, they're at home. So when we try to generalize these numbers um, to child welfare involvements in general, you get into trouble really fast. You haven't made it very deep before you realize, like, if the numbers here are indicative of national numbers, we're talking about 500,000 children in the country who are court dependent. That's a lot of children. So, you know, um, it's baffling to me that we don't have a national tracking number for this. I would assume that every state, or almost every state, does track this number. California definitely does, obviously, and then you could aggregate it from there. But again, the national numbers, there are certain requirements, reporting requirements for those national numbers. So the data, if you gather it manually from state to state, is not going to be of the same quality as the other nationally reported numbers would be. So we have to be a little bit careful. Of course, we could go and gather that fairly simply, but it's not going to be as reliable as we would hope. But in California, yeah, that's a quarter of court dependent kids not captured by these numbers. Obviously, their plan is not reunification, right? Their plan is family preservation. So, it's a whole different category of kids. But once again, they are court dependent. Okay, so average age. It is 8.3, but 8.3 is not the mode, right? Like, you're not looking at the population of foster kids and, like, 3/4 of them are 8 years old. That's not how this works. So when you break it down, more than a third are 5 or younger, okay, and 40% are 11 and up. all the way up to their 21st birthday. So that captures 10 years. So if we were going to do this perfectly, we would measure 0 to 7, or 0 to 6, I suppose, 7 to 13, and 14 to 21. We would do it that way, but that is not how the data is aggregated. So we can't quite do it like that. But the reason why we don't, by the way, is that there's different legal definitions and requirements for children who are 5 or younger than there are for children who are over 5, and we'll talk about more of that in the second part of the lecture. In any case, it turns out that those 8.3-year-olds are actually the smallest portion of children who are in foster care. 25% are ages 6 to 10. So, this average age 8.3, right off the bat, very simply, we can see, like, yes, technically that's the average age. When you add everybody together and, divide by the denominator, sure, that's what you get. But it doesn't give you an accurate picture of what the population is. Okay, so moving along through our points, all minority children, but especially Black and Native American children, are disproportionately represented. Okay, so this is not because it's not really about the Child Welfare Agency. It's not about the referrals. It's not about the investigations. It's not about foster care itself. It's not really about any of that. To a certain small extent, it is. But the main issue is that the whole system is disproportionately angled against minority children. That is simply fact. The whole thing is biased against minority kids. Minority kids then tend to be they tend to have fewer resources, right? They tend to have fewer privileges. They tend to have fewer supports. They tend to have less money. They tend to have less secure housing. All of those things are true. And so at all levels of the system, they experience a higher level of disadvantage. So when you think it through from Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, right, from that perspective, which you covered in the very first topic of the class, right, when you think it through from that angle, and you picture that diagram in your head of those concentric circles, there are disadvantages for these children on every level of the model. And so the Child Welfare Agency is just one more part of their system that has, biases built into it, is built on kind of biased foundations. We've worked very hard, especially in California, in the last half century to kind of address those. But make no mistake, they are still there in a lot of ways that are just going to take more time than this to deal with, right? So we do talk about that a little bit more in the careers section of the course, and we did cover it a little bit in the first lectures where we talked about the feminization of social work, that sort of thing. So. You just have to consider here that it's not really child welfare so much that is acting in a biased way, so much as it is that the children have disadvantages that send them into child welfare services, right? So, okay. Similar issue here. 20 to 30% of youth who age out of care experience homelessness within a few years. But that's not necessarily because they were failed in foster care, except the first bullet is when they were failed in foster care. So educational challenges, absolutely. This one is very directly linked to just flat out being in foster care, because the nature of being a foster youth, and is that you are enrolled in school where your foster parents live, and there's a lot of toing and froing in in foster placements, and so kids move to one district or the next district or whatever, and every time their school placement is disrupted, they lose ground, right? They lose educational ground. Now, there has been legislation passed that seeks to address this. There are policies in place where the hope is that the child is maintained in the district from which they come. In reality, that often cannot happen, right? So if you have a child who is dependent of San Francisco County and they're placed in Modesto, they cannot go to school in San Francisco. It's not going to work. So, if the choice of the child welfare agency is put this kid in a group home and keep them in the school that they're in, or send them to a foster home in Modesto and have to change them to a Modesto school, usually, unless the kid says, I'd rather go to a group home, which I've never heard a kid say. It's not out of the realm of possibility, but then they're gonna switch schools, right? So, legislation or not, the reality of the situation is that education takes a huge hit. And that's not the only way that education takes a huge hit either, right? Because we know that children who are struggling with hunger, or struggling with mental illness, or struggling with trauma, or struggling with substance abuse, or any number of other things, not to even mention maltreatment, right? There are educational impacts of that. So we have to be very aware that education is extremely vulnerable to these children being in foster care, and really put our attention on mitigating some of those effects to the greatest extent possible. Okay. So there are a bunch of other reasons, and I'm not going to go through every single one of them. There's a lot on this list, and there's many more that are not on this list. But the bottom line is that once again, just like the bullet above, these kids are already a product of disadvantage. There are a lot of disadvantages that were already there before they were ever brought into care in the first place, and they don't go away because they went into foster care. Now, sure, they could have ended up in foster homes where their mental illness got worse, their trauma got worse. Like there are certainly bad foster parents in the world. Depending on who you ask, the proportion of that changes. But for sure, there are absolutely kids who get worse in foster care because of foster care. But a lot of this 20 to 30% of homelessness within a few years really does come from those existing disadvantages that those kids were already experiencing, and probably brought them into care in the first place. It's not the cause of their homelessness. Foster care, I mean. So, average length of stay, 21 months. So this one is particularly insidious, this particular set of facts, because if you don't think about it really carefully, you're going to get it completely upside down. So reunification, the average length of stay is about 11 months, emancipation. So basically, that means the youth is older, and there's not a reasonable expectation that they're going to be adopted or moved to guardianship, or they don't want to be. Right. So, if you have a 14-year-old who's like, yeah, I have parents, I don't want to be adopted, their plan is going to be emancipation. If they can't go home, if they can't be reunified, and there's no family who's going to take them, and there's no guardianship, their plan is going to be emancipation. Right. Guardianship is similar to adoption, but it is not. It is not as. It's revocable. Let's put it that way. Adoption is not revocable. You get a new birth certificate and the whole thing, right? But for guardianship, your parents are still your parents. But for the most part, they can't. It's harder to end guardianship. And in adoption, it's just not an option. There's just no mechanism for that. So speaking of adoption, so the average length of stay for kids who are going to be adopted, almost 3 years. All right. So these numbers look a little strange if you think about it, okay? But you have to be savvy about where they come from. So let's take adoption first. So these kids, they're let's do it simply. Let's assume that we're talking about a newborn. Okay, so a child is born in the hospital. They're drug addicted. They're removed, right? And they're put into a resource home. All right. The parents have the time period that they have, 6 months, a year. It kind of depends, but it's not unheard of. To have a baby remain in foster care for a year while their parents work on it. 6 months is the guideline for babies, but it absolutely happens all the time, in fact. And so there's a whole year where the plan is reunification. Well, we've already, now we're at 12 months, right? So after that has come to an end and there's a hearing where the reunification plan has ended and the plan has now been shifted to adoption, a whole bunch of things have to happen in order to make that happen. And the parental rights being terminated takes a whole bunch of time, and you can't be adopted if your parents still legally have rights to you. So we have to have the parental rights terminated on the biological parents, and that is a whole thing. So it can take months or years to do that. And there are things that can make it more or less complicated. I had one case where it took 4 years just to get the termination of parental rights. That's unusual, but it does happen. It just sort of depends what's going on in the case and what the complications are, whether there's legal arguments about what has whether the correct services have been provided and all of that stuff, right? We'll talk about that more in the second part of the lecture. But the idea is that they've gone all the way through all this time for reunification, and then there's a whole bunch of time added on top of that for making sure that we have the right adoptive home, right? Because they might not be in a home that is prepared to adopt them, right? They might be, in a foster home with 75-year-old foster parents, and they're not in a position to adopt. Well, now we have to find adoptive parents for these kids, right? And then we have to move the child and make sure that is a solid adoptive home and that those people are willing to adopt this child, and all of that takes time. So, the court is not in the habit of making legal orphans. So unless and until there are adoptive parents identified, they are not going to terminate parental rights. If you see a child freed for adoption, that means their parents do not have parental rights, and they are not in an adoptive home, something somewhere has gone wrong, because judges just are not going to free kids for adoption unless they have a reasonable expectation of a specific adoption occurring. That's not to say that adoptive placements don't break down. They obviously do, right? So that's how you run into kids who are freed for adoption, and they are not in an adoptive home. Okay, so 108,000 waiting for adoption. This is not the number you think it is, right? So, as I said, these kids are not going to be freed for adoption until they are in an adoptive home. So this number, this 108,000 child number, includes all of those children who are in adoptive homes of the home that of the parents that intend to adopt them. But technically, they're waiting for adoption, right? They're still in foster care until the day that adoption has been completed. So they're all waiting for adoption, even if they've been there for years. That's the only placement that they've ever been in. That's the only placement they're ever going to be in. That it's just not the number you think it is, right? So it just encapsulates every kid who it has a plan of adoption, and where it hasn't been completed yet. So that's just a lot of kids with a plan for adoption. It does include a number of kids who don't have an adoptive placement. For sure it does. So like that's probably what you're picturing in your mind as kids waiting for adoption, is like kids who literally do not have anybody who's interested in adopting them. That is not the case. That is not what this number represents. All right. Right. So, we covered a lot of this, but what I really want to emphasize is that reunification is the goal if it can be achieved safely. Always it is the goal if it can be achieved safely. So because of that, nearly always the other outcomes, emancipation, guardianship, adoption, whatever it is, are all a result of reunification not being viable, right? Either it has failed, right? They attempted to have a reunification plan and it was not completed, or reunification wasn't offered in the first place, right? So, for example, if your parent has had other children removed, and the reason why and not reunified, and the reason that was so has not changed. So, for example, if you have a mother who has had multiple children removed because, her drug addiction has made it so that she could not care for her children, when the next baby is born, there is something called bypass. So the county will remove the child. Again, if nothing has changed, right? She's still using, all the situation is the same, whatever it is. The county will remove the child and then ask the court to bypass reunification services, with the idea that, the reunification failed on previous children. And if nothing has changed, there's no reason why it would not fail for this child. And permanency for a new child, especially a newborn, is more important than hoping that the reunification services will have a different outcome with the same set of basic facts. Now, you can fight bypass, for sure, right? Like, so if mom If mom says no, 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 like I want reunification services for my baby, for the most part, the judge will grant that. They will grant, 6 months of reunification services and say to the child welfare agency, make sure this child is placed in a potential adoptive home. But while they're there, mom's going to get reunification services because, if we can put this kid back safely, we're going to do that. There are plenty of parents who have lost the custody of their older children but raise younger children, right? And sometimes the way that happens is that the circumstance is the same in the beginning, but they say, like, no, I'm going to do it differently this time. And the court is going to give them a chance to do that if it makes sense to do so. If they've said that three times before and it has not changed and they failed all three of those times that they said that, then maybe they don't. But if they've had, 5 kids removed and this is the first time that they've said, no, 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 I want to do it differently this time, then yeah, I mean, they're usually going to give them a chance. The judge really, really, really wants to have those kids reunified with their biological parent if they can. So remember how I said that the agency will try to make sure that the placement that child has is a placement that can be permanent, that the option is that those people will adopt that child if that child becomes available for adoption. Well, that's called concurrent planning. And concurrent planning, the idea is that we always have a plan and a backup plan, right? So usually reunification is the primary plan, and then we're also kind of working on the backup plan in the background. So if we're working on reunification services for mom, but we also want to make sure that, like, if reunification services don't work, if they are not successful, is this child ready to seamlessly move into the adoption pipeline? And of course, the way to do that is to make sure that they're placed in a home that will adopt them in the first place. Okay. In the olden days, these timelines were longer, right? Because child welfare just didn't always pursue concurrent planning. It was like, we're going to throw all of our time and energy into reunification, and then if reunification doesn't work out, we'll take it from there. That's not how we do it anymore, because the research is super clear that getting kids out of foster care as quickly as possible is in their best interest. So we're now planning, for plans A and B and sometimes C at the same time, right? So reunification is always going to be the shortest length of stay because it's the only pathway that doesn't have any turns in it, right? Like you begin at reunification, you end at reunification. It's not like you go through reunification, that plan fails, and then you go and do adoption for a while, and then you go back to reunification. That's not how that works, right? Once reunification services are terminated, they're over, and then you move on. Guardianship, adoption, emancipation, whatever it is. But you're pretty much always starting from whatever baseline of that reunification timeline was. So if you're starting from 11 months, and then the plan becomes guardianship, you can often end up in a guardianship with less than 6 months after that, right? So, if grandma is willing to do guardianship, right? Reunification fails, and mom had a year, reunification fails, grandma's willing to do guardianship but not adoption, then that it doesn't necessarily have to take that long. So, and that bears out in the statistics that the guardianship and reunification numbers are so close together. Adoption is longer for the reasons that I already explained. Emancipation. So this one is tricky, right? So these are the youth where, yes, reunification is probably where they started. But they were probably older when they came into care in the first place. Not always, but for sure. I mean, I've had plenty of kids on my caseload who, their plan was emancipation. They're like 17 years old and they've been in foster care since they were 3. For sure, that is a thing. But, a lot of times what ends up happening is that they come into care when they're a little bit older in the first place, and they don't have anybody who's willing to do guardianship. Reunification has failed or it doesn't make sense, and they don't want to be adopted, or they don't even want to try to find a home to be adopted. If you think about it, if you come into care and you're like 12 years old, 13 years old, you have parents. They might not be very good at what they do, but you have parents, and you're not willing to be calling somebody else mom or dad, right? So emancipation often will be the only other option for those kids, right? Because you don't have reunification services anymore. There's no guardian on the horizon, and the kid doesn't want to be adopted. So that's where we are, right? So that happens a lot with teenagers. Um, so yeah, I mean the takeaway is not, on average kids spend almost 2 years in foster care. That's not the takeaway. It's we're gonna try to get you home first. If you don't go home, some plans are gonna that come after that are gonna take longer than others. That's the bottom line. So this is a good place to pause and see if any of that information challenged the assumptions that you had coming into the lecture, right? So this is the original slide that you saw. Obviously, I made it a little bit smaller. And with that information on it, with that basic information, and we have taken every one of these bullet points and kind of pulled them apart and realized that every single one of them does not look the way that we thought it did, right? So, for your notes, like now, do you still have a mental picture of that typical foster kid? And if you do have that mental picture, has it changed? What does it look like now, right? What else has changed, right? What else has been challenged? So spend a little bit of time to pause, write some notes to yourself about that, and then um, I want you to think about getting in the habit of bringing those assumptions to the forefront of your mind um, before you really get too deep into the content, right? So, you are scaffolded to do that here, right? I have asked you explicitly to consider your biases and your assumptions before really engaging with this material. I asked you to do that, and basically the first slide. And but I'm not going to do that in every lecture, right? But it's a really good idea for you to get into the habit of thinking through, what is my default thought here? Where did that set of ideas come from? What's the story that I have learned about this topic? And when you can do that, not even necessarily, bouncing it off another person, an instructor, whoever, but when you can do that, when you can get into the habit of kind of, naming those biases and assumptions, at least to yourself, then it helps you learn the material more deeply, because you're kind of thinking about it in a more active way, but it also helps you kind of challenge those biases as you go forward. And are you going to encounter facts that confirm them? Sure, probably, but you're also going to encounter facts that contradict those biases and assumptions, and if you have not brought them into your conscious mind, it's going to be really difficult for you to change your thought process about those things. You're much more likely to just kind of ignore them because they don't fit in with your understanding of how a particular topic works. So when you bring that bias to the forefront of your mind, you're more willing to consider information that contradicts it. All right. So we have some terms to begin with. Child welfare is not an agency. Child welfare is like everything that is intended to, improve the well-being of children. Now, we don't always think of all of those programs and services as child welfare services. We do tend to think of child welfare services as CPS, but CPS, Child Protective Services, is a very specific type of agency. It's not always called that. There are plenty of places that call it something different. We even call it something different from county to county in California. Either way, what they do is essentially all the same. They're responsible to investigate allegations and have the power to, put children into foster care and all of that stuff, right? So CPS is an agency, but child welfare is kind of a set of philosophies and programs and activities and interventions and all of that stuff, and the law as well, right? So that's child welfare. So another foundational definition that you will have heard me already say multiple times is maltreatment. Okay, so maltreatment, technically, as it is defined in CAPTA, and it's defined in other laws slightly differently, but as it's defined in CAPTA, is a recent act or failure to act on the part of a parent or caretaker, which results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse or exploitation, or an act or failure to act which presents an imminent risk of serious harm. Wow, there is a lot of stuff in that definition. So, one word that really should jump out at you is the word recent. Okay? So, technically, if we're talking about something that happened 10 years ago, that's not going to be defined as maltreatment, right? So, why does that matter? If a report is made about an incident that happened a really long time ago, you are going to have a really hard time substantiating that allegation because it has to be recent. And like, how do we define that? And I think in practice we often define recent as, is it something that could happen again, right? So, if we're talking about, I left the child in a hot car when they were 2 years old, and now they're 12. Well, that's not going to happen again because they can let themselves out, right? So you're not going to be able to get a substantiation of that allegation. Also, there's no proof, but that's a different issue. So, the foundational definition has all of these kind of like little caveats to it that we have to be really careful of. So, the exploitation is another word that kind of pops out. We think of sexual abuse as, this very specific set of images in our heads, but exploitation has a much wider definition than that. It includes prostitution, trafficking, all types of trafficking too, not just sexual trafficking. There's way more than that. So the other thing I want to point out to you is that failure to act has just as much weight in this definition as doing the act. Okay, so there's something called failure to protect. And we see failure to protect in and allegations all the time. So what does that mean? So let's say you have two parents and one of them is the active perpetrator. So let's say that this is a physical abuse case. One of the parents is physically abusing the child. If the other parent does not take action to resolve the situation, take the child out of the situation, or call the police, or whatever it is, right? If they don't take any action, that's failure to protect. And so, when the child is removed or becomes court dependent, the both parents will be the subject of that investigation, because they didn't, one of them was doing the actual harm, but the other one was not protecting the child from that harm or attempting to protect the child from that harm. Now, if that other parent called CPS, right, or called the police on the perpetrating parent, then when a report is filed, if a report is filed, because a lot of times in that case, you can kind of go right around it, and not go to court at all, and end up in differential response, which we'll talk about later, or any number of other paths that do not involve going to court. But that lots of things can happen when a parent acts protectively, and the other one does not. But if you don't act protectively, then the case is going to involve you as well. So, just kind of like a closing idea on this part of the lecture. Being aware of your context, where you come from and what your biases are, and how you approach a family or child welfare in general, or, any of these topics is a requirement. It's an ethical requirement to work in child welfare, because you cannot work with families if you're not aware of how you're respecting their dignity and their uniqueness, right? If you have a bias against a certain type of family, or a certain type of maltreatment, and that happens a lot, it's going to show up in your work. So you have to be aware of that. And you also have to remember that every family is different. When you do this for a long time, you start to see patterns in families. And one family will remind you of a different family. And if you're not careful, you will lean so hard into that reminder of that first family that you will fail to see the parts of the new family that are completely unique to them. You should never put yourself in a situation where you are thinking to yourself, I will just do exactly the same thing on this case that I did on that case because everything is the same. That's going to get you into trouble because, as it says on the last bullet here, even if the case is just like the one from last week, and its fact pattern, which no, it isn't, because you just haven't dug down deep enough, the family itself is going to have different strengths, right? They're going to have different supports. They're going to have different personality structures, different strengths, different areas to draw upon that will help them resolve the case. And when you're not paying enough attention to that uniqueness and being strengths based, you are going to miss it, right? You're going to miss those cues for what those things are in that family that make them special and that bring them strength to figure out the case that they're in and come out the other side and have the case close with the children in their care. So, we we need to put that first, right? We need to put that respect and dignity of the uniqueness of the family first on our list, because without it, you're not going to be able to identify what that family needs to use to get where they need to go. All right. So, being aware of differences in values and practices, um, you are not going to be culturally competent. That is not a thing. There is no such thing as being culturally competent. Um, we have to understand that the differences in values and practices are not fully knowable, right? No matter how many classes you take, no matter how many people you talk to, you're not going to know everything. You're not going to be able to pick up on every nuance. If it is not also your context, you are, and even if it is, right, because there's individual differences between families and all of that stuff, but you have to be aware of the difference between where your values sit, where your practices are built upon, and those of the family in front of you, right? And putting that into words, like my values are this, their values are that, or having them put their values into words, right, which is often very illuminating, will again set you up to succeed in a situation where it can look very difficult to succeed, right? Because if their value is children are loyal to the family, right? If that's one of the main values in their house, and you see that as they always tell their children not to talk to social workers, not helpful, But if you see that as we value family cohesion, right? Now suddenly, again, we're in a strengths-based place. So, you need to think of things creatively. So, you also need to understand your own reactions, right? And this can be very difficult when you are new in the field or if you are simply young, right? Because you might not know. You might not have had enough experience, of this type of work, right? Or these types of folks, people from their cultural context, their culture, versus yours. You might just not know, right? What your reactions are going to be, or you do know, and you are, for example, assigned a case that is in family reunification where the issue at hand, or one of the issues at hand, is sexual abuse. And you think to yourself, there is no way that I can support reunification in a family where sexual abuse is a factor. Well, you have to be aware that that is your reaction. That, like, it doesn't matter what else is true in this situation. If sexual abuse is one of the allegations that has been substantiated, and now the case plan is reunification, I can't get behind that. I don't want those kids back in that house. Well, right, you need to understand that reaction, because now it's time to go talk to your supervisor, because your mindset is putting you in a place where you can't support that family in the way that they are legally due. Right? It does not matter whether you think that they deserve it or not, whether you think that it's a good idea or not. Legally speaking, they have a right to your full set of services. And if you don't think that you can provide those, you need to seek supervision, because either that needs to get resolved, or they need to be transferred to somebody else, because it as the court case progresses, if the worker is not doing everything that they are obligated to do to support a family, it will come back later. It will make the case draw out. It can result in, failed permanent placements, because now we're back in reunification and we didn't think that we would be, because, the CPS didn't do everything that they were supposed to do. So we really need to make sure that we're aware of our own reactions, so that we don't put CPS as an agency in the situation of having to go back and do something again because you didn't do it, right? Because you couldn't. So the last thing is, be curious about how you're being seen by this family, right? And you have to have a little bit of tact about this. It's like, you can't just walk up to a family an hour after you've met them and say, so, how do you experience me as a social worker? That's not going to work, but as you work a case with a family, alongside a family, it's pretty important that you understand how they see you, because especially if you come from very different cultural contexts, some interesting things can come out in that conversation. And if you are working from a strengths-based place, if you are thinking of everything as an opportunity to foster conversation and build a connection and have, move forward in the relationship, because a big part of success for families and child welfare is their relationship with the assigned worker, right? Having this information really helps you to do all of that stuff. It really helps you to connect to them. So, that's my advice about being aware of where you're coming from, and how you're approaching the family. Okay, now we're gonna go on to part 2 of the lecture.